It is official. The coronavirus is now called a global pandemic by the World Health Organization. That shouldn't really be surprising given the fact that the virus has been spreading and spread now to 114 countries, over 6 continents, with over 100,000 cases and counting. As difficult as these times may be for 1 billion Chinese here and many more around the world, bias and politics surrounding the virus didn't stop. Some U.S. politicians continue to blame China for the current outbreak in America. And the reports of the New York Times on China's lockdown versus Italy's lockdown made some people believe that there is a double standard. Meanwhile, last week the U.S. Senate passed a resolution on Chinese doctor Li Wenliang, who unfortunately and tragically died from coronavirus. What should we make of that? Joining me now for the discussion of these issues via Skype is Professor Liu Baocheng at the University of International Business and Economics, and from Philadelphia, Brendan Blackburn-Dwyer, founder of Grasshopper Strategies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. First, let's start with the New York Times reports. On Sunday, New York Times said regarding the Wuhan lockdown that, quote, to fight the coronavirus, China placed nearly 60 million people under lockdown and instituted strict quarantine and travel restrictions for hundreds of millions of others. Its campaign has come at great cost to people's lives and personal liberties. And then, in just 20 minutes, the New York Times tweeted this about Italy's lockdown, saying, Italy is locking down Milan, Venice, and much of its north, risking its economy in an effort to contain Europe's worst coronavirus outbreak. Brandon, I want to go to you. Do you think the Chinese are too sensitive, or is there a double standard regarding the different reports?
In this case, I think this is a case of being too sensitive. When you look at the tweets, one is tweeting to an article about China that is an analysis of the over 6 weeks of quarantine and the impact that it has had on the Chinese economy, which has been vast. And that impact is something that the world is talking about and focusing on. In terms of the Italy tweet, we are talking about breaking news. So there isn't any analysis. There isn't any knowledge about how much this has actually hurt the economy yet, or what it has done to personal liberties, or what it has done on the individual level. All we knew at that point on Sunday was, hey, Italy just announced this, and if we know from the example of China, this is going to come at an economic cost, hence the language putting Italy's economy at risk. So for me, I think a lot of people tried to draw comparisons that took away the time issue. That one article was about analysis over events that we have some perspective on, and the other was simply announcing a new development and basically saying, look, there's going to be an economic cost, just like there was in China.
But Brandon, with, well, in all fairness, the New York Times report on Italy's lockdown, the report framed the issue as if Italy is willing to do that, to sacrifice its economy to lock down the entire country to fight the virus, whereas in Wuhan's lockdown report, it says it's coming at great cost to people's liberties. You don't hear about New York Times talking about liberties, personal liberties regarding Italy's lockdown.
I think you're seeing the same critique of quarantines around the world right now. You had the United States, you had multiple different judges giving conflicting rulings on whether quarantining passengers from cruise ships actually were allowed by law. You have Canada with a history with SARS quarantine back in 2003, a history of court cases and criminal charges brought against those who ordered quarantine. So Western media has grappled with and is continuing to grapple with the question about whether quarantines are a violation of civil liberties, whether we should be accepting them for the greater good, how and how expansive they can be for the greater good. And you're seeing that in Italy. Italy had a prison riot with prisoners saying, hey, if the rest of the country is being quarantined, we need better treatment. That was an uprising in a prison that was largely about the concerns of safety and civil liberties. Throughout the country, Italy has struggled to actually implement its now nationwide lockdown, in large part because citizens are basically saying, this is my liberty to be able to move around. By contrast, China was able to very successfully quarantine 60 million people, and largely the population acquiesce to this. Now, that's a difference in culture, it's a difference in situation, it's a difference in scale of authority, and it should be celebrated that China was so able to do it, but it does come with, obviously, economic costs, obviously costs of personal freedoms, just like we are seeing the emerging large-scale quarantines in Italy and potentially in the United States and other countries coming at economic and cost to civil liberties.
Well, Professor Liu, do you believe there is a double standards regarding the Western reports on the Wuhan lockdown versus the Italy's lockdown?
Well, actually, everyone from a Chinese perspective would read a deflection of the situation, and there is a double standard because that's really reflective of the deep-rooted bias. And actually, every country would make different type of reaction, but we all have to share a common understanding that every country will have to pay a certain economic cost, will have to, individuals will have to surrender certain freedom to move around and also to be able to receive quarantine service, etc. So whatever China is doing is there, to trying to strike an even keel at different time between personal health and safety versus economic growth. So at the initial stage, China did really focus on that, and we would rather go to a certain extreme to really to contain the virus for a better tomorrow. So now we do see the improvement in such a drastic manner within China is a result of Chinese willingness to pay certain price economically and also in terms of individual freedom. So it does not really have to be criticized in a very biased manner.
Right, Professor Liu, there are many comments on the global media scene. On Twitter, for example, a user named Farman Ali. I want to show you this tweet. Twitter user Farman Ali said, "Whatever China does, Western media will remain critical. If China does nothing, they will be criticized, and if they do something, they will also get criticism." Is that true? I mean, is there a streak of Western narrative that frames China issues versus Western issues in different lights?
Well, I think that there is also a deeply vested belief that, the basic scenario is that, okay, China has a very aristocratic government, and the draconian measures will definitely, invade into people's privacy and restrict people's freedom, and also the government is also paying a lot of economic prices, and they are denoting to the fact that the Chinese governance, the Chinese management is not up to their standard. So given this deep-rooted bias, and yes, anything China does, if we don't do anything, they may blame, well, we reacted very slowly. Yes, we are not really acting perfectly. There has been ill transparency. There has been delay in the reporting system. But China is really sincerely making a lot of efforts at government level and also at individual level.
Well, I don't want to spend all the time bashing a New York Times report or commenting on the New York Times report because there is a pandemic going on. We see cases rising in America, in Europe, and across the world. Indeed, let's talk about what lessons and experiences China can offer to these countries who are fighting this epidemic. Let's begin with the economics. According to the Asian Development Bank, China bears much of the brunt of the coronavirus outbreak, in that 2/3 of the global economic impact of COVID-19 is on China. China's economy is expected to shrink between 0.8 to 1.7%. Of course, on one hand, China's extreme measures arguably worked and worked well. But on the other hand, do you think that is a model that can be copied around the world, especially in those countries that are currently fighting this epidemic? Brendan.
Well, you're asking a number of different things here. first of all, I think we're already seeing the difficulty of other countries following in a large-scale quarantine. I referenced that Italy is struggling to convince many of its citizens to take it seriously, that there is widespread reports that compliance with quarantine is spotty in various parts of Italy. So that's going to be very difficult. I think that you saw China able to implement the quarantine a lot faster and a lot more whole-scale than we will see in a lot of Western nations. Now, on the economic side, you're right. So far, China has taken on the brunt of the economic impact. And we've been talking about that for weeks now, in large part because China is so intertwined with the rest of the world that when China's economy is slowing down, it's only a matter of time before the rest of the world feels that impact. Now, going beyond that, we're only starting to, I think, really see the beginning of the on-the-ground impact in the United States of economics. So right now, we can say 2/3 of the economic brunt has been felt by China. But I think if you look ahead to another month, the NBA suspending its season, schools canceling, businesses closing, universities closing for 4 and 6 weeks in the United States, we're going to start seeing that economic impact that China unfortunately saw first on the ground also being seen by the United States on the ground. And that's going to be very, very, very difficult both politically and culturally for the United States. I live in a country that 60% of people say they cannot survive a $400 unexpected bill. We were about to see hourly wage workers potentially being sent home across the United States, losing themselves hundreds, if not thousands of dollars of expected income, and that is going to be an economic disaster.
Well, very quickly, Professor Liu, we have about 30, 40 seconds here. What should the governments around the world do? Because we see a financial meltdown on one hand and economic impacts on the other.
Well, I think from a humanity perspective, they need to pay attention, but they have to really move in a more proactive manner by supporting the R&D companies to develop vaccine and drugs. And in the meantime, before we really see the availability of those vaccines, we have to take precautions measures and also to educate the public for better compliance for their own safety. But of course, over a longer term, it's really the economy that really matters for all politicians and local governments.
Well, Professor, so talking about politicians, the U.S. Senate just passed a law commemorating in name of the deceased Chinese doctor Li Wenliang. What do you make of that? Well,
Li Wenliang is really highly commendable. To me, he's not really a whistleblower, but he's a whisperer of the true situation. He really alerted the China, and he really contributed a lot, and he died also more or less like a martyr. But he cannot really be used as a sort of evidence to criticize the Chinese government in ill-treating him, because the situation in China is very vastly different to what is being understood in the West.
All right, I'm afraid, Professor, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much, Professor Liu Baocheng and Brendan Blackburn Dwyer from Philadelphia. Thank you both. Now we'll take a short break and stay with us.